Okay?
Clear, clear, clear.
Yes or no?
Yes.
All right.
So shall I start?
1 minute. Yes, we are live.
Shall I begin, sir?
Yes.
Jai Bhim and a very good evening to all of you. On behalf of IADF and Ambedkar's Caravan, I would like to welcome all of you for today's series of conversation and race and caste. I am Dr. Farhana Parveen, Care and Cure Dental Clinic, practicing a dental surgeon at Chhattisgarh, Bhilai. Today we have with us Sir Paul, who is a historical researcher and a founder of World Dhamma Foundation, USA. And we have with us Mangesh Dahiwale, sir, who writes regularly on the issue of caste and philosophy of Babasaheb Ambedkar. So I hand it over to Mangesh, sir. Sir, please.
Farhana, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome, Paul. I think this is our third conversation, and so far we have had conversation on the history of colonialism in India and America. We had that discussion in the first conversation, and we tried to build on that discussion in the next conversation, where we talked about where we discussed about race and caste and how they are the part of the same problem. And today we are going to talk about the historical interactions between our communities in the past, and that is going to be the topic of our discussion today. As we know now that there has been a lot of research on the interaction between the people in the Indian subcontinent and the African Americans. And there has been a very intense interaction between the Indians and the African Americans. And there are two important books that have come up. One is titled as a Color Cosmopolitanism by Nico Slate, where he goes into the interaction of the Indians, particularly most of them, majority of them are coming from the so-called upper caste backgrounds, who try to ride over the colonialism and the racism as the same categories, and they had intense connection. And there is another book that has come up, which is titled as The End of Empire, written by Gerald Horne, about African Americans and India, where he has also gone into depth of the interactions between the Indians and the African Americans when India was colonialized, and a lot of interaction was taking place. And a lot of people look at the impact of Gandhi on the African American movement, but there is now a solid research which has come up, which shows that the African Americans have impacted Gandhi as well a lot, and particularly G.W. Karwar, and there were a host of people. Indians were also traveling a lot. Lala Lajpat Rai was traveling in USA, interacting with W. Du Bois, and so on and so forth. But that's basically an interaction based on the concept of colonialism as racism. But we know that there was a group of so-called Indians who were claiming that they are Aryans, Caucasians, and also they were trying to claim the US citizenship in the early part of the last century, and they successfully did it, saying that they are the Aryans, they are whites, while the Dravidians, or the people in the South India, they are from the lower caste, they are not Caucasians, and that's how they fooled a lot of people. But interestingly, today's discussion is about the interaction between the Dalits and the blacks in the historical context. It goes back to 1913, when Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar went to Columbia University, and the university is located in Harlem, which was in 1913 onwards. 1913, 14, 15, 16, Babasaheb Ambedkar was there, and that was a period of what is now known in the African American history as the Harlem Renaissance, where arts, dramas, poetry by the African Americans was flourishing in Harlem, which was very famous, which is still very famous part of the New York City, and very lively part in the jazz clubs and whatnot, where the creativity of the African American artist was exploding. And Eleanor Joliet argues that how cannot Babasaheb Ambedkar know what is happening there, because he was just living very next to the Harlem locality. I think, Babasaheb Ambedkar continued to go deeper into his interest in the African American community. We can read his books, and we can see that there are definite connections with the African American communities, particularly when the so-called upper caste Indians were trying to bring these categories of the caste and the category of race and colony together, and claiming that the Indian problem of untouchability was not as severe as the problem of the African Americans. And Babasaheb Ambedkar was arguing that yes, the problem of untouchability is also very severe, very heinous, and also very inhuman. So there was this sort of dialogues and debates happening on this issue of the African Americans and their connections with the caste, particularly the untouchables, which we have discussed in our two conversations. But there is also very historical information that has now come up. Is in 1940s, the Indian Muslims were traveling to the America. Even before that, particularly now what is called the Pakistan, from Pakistan, a lot of Indian Muslims went to work with the African American Muslims in America. And now there are a lot of stories that some Dalits were also there who traveled to America and interacted with the African American community. So there were definite a wave, not only during the World War II, that the African American soldiers were coming to India, and they were facing a lot of discrimination by the hands of the Indians in India during the World War II. But also, in the 40s, the people, the Muslims from the Indian subcontinent, were traveling to America to work with the African American brothers and sisters there. And another thing is, we know that in 1965, a letter has come out now, written by a very close associate of Babasaheb Ambedkar in October 1965. That was like the heydays of the civil rights movement in America. The name of the close lieutenant of Babasaheb Ambedkar is Barrister Khobragade, who worked very closely with Babasaheb Ambedkar, who was very well educated. He was barrister, bar at law, and a very important politician of India at that time. So in 1965, he went to Atlanta, Georgia, the epicenter of the civil rights movement, and he wanted to seek a meeting with Martin Luther King in 1965. And then we know that the 70s onwards, the Dalit Panthers have taken their inspiration from the Black Panthers of America. And we know that the people from in India, where particularly Dalits, were trying to, because that time the category of the race and colony was nowhere there, because India had attained and India had a transfer of power from the Britishers to India. So no longer this category was useful that time. So attention shifted to caste and race, and particularly Dalits took interest in the Black Power movement, other aspect of the Black movement there. So I think with this background, I would like to hand it over to Brother Paul to comment on on what I just said.
Well, that's a lot. Okay. As you mentioned, Dr. Ambedkar lived less than a mile from 125th Street, less than a mile from the epicenter of the artistic and intellectual movement that was taking place in the teens in this country, the Renaissance that was taking place. He lived less than a mile from it, and he did observe, being there, he was there. He did observe what was happening in this country relative to Blacks at that time in New York City, Harlem. In addition to that, he also later he also asked questions about the blacks in this country, who he called untouchables, Black American untouchables. And that's recorded in I think a few notes here. I wasn't exactly certain where we were heading with our conversation if we were going to look at the this aspect or that aspect of this issue. But he was there's a writer, and you're well aware with this, Ambedkar, Herbert Ambedkar. He wrote a work called The Negro in the Civil War, and you're familiar with that, and I'll point out why later. But you're the one that basically Mangesh brought all of this information to the fore. That Herbert Ambedkar, he was a student of Carter G. Woodson, who is a very well-known historian here in this country, Black historian in this country. He was also taught by W.E.B. Du Bois, and he was the editor of Du Bois's papers after Du Bois passed away. He speaks about the Dalits of India in his work in 1945. He talks about the problem of caste in a book called The Negro in the Civil War. So we can see that there was talk about caste, relating caste to the problem of Black people in this country in as early as 1945. There's also talk about it earlier than that. C. Van Woodward, who wrote a book, a very important book called The Strange Career of Jim Crow, a very important work. That book, he said, was inspired by the burgeoning civil rights movement in this country in 1957, and by his talks with Dr. Ambedkar, and by his talks earlier with Dr. Ambedkar. So the book, one of the more important books in the civil rights movement in this country, called The Strange Career of Jim Crow, was inspired largely by the work of Dr. Ambedkar and the Dalit movement. You know about that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to share that for the audience.
Please.
In this country, because we're not so much aware that the struggle has been intricately bound together. Those things are largely not included in our Black Studies classes. They want to leave out, for some reason, the connection between Dr. Ambedkar and the Dalit movement, the movement for justice in India. That's been largely kept away from us. And so we don't see as much of a connection until after it's pointed out. So there's a lot of connections. There was a newspaper that's called the Pittsburgh Courier. And that paper played a very important role in informing Black people in this country about what was going on. It was kind of like the Google for Black people.
Right.
Back in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s. Because there was no Google then. So there was the Pittsburgh Courier, and there was a writer there named George Schuler. And George Schuler, he wrote for the Pittsburgh Courier, and he's been called the greatest journalist in this country. And he was very radical in his thoughts and his ideas. And his writing. He saw that there was a difference between what was being taught by Dr. Ambedkar. He started writing back in 1931. And there's some very interesting parallels that he was drawing back as early as 31. And that is a rabbit hole that we might not want to get into right now, except he saw that there was a difference between what was being taught or what was being supported and pushed by Gandhi, which he called a scam, which Schuler thought of as a scam against the lower castes in India. Gandhi as pushing a program that was a trick, that it was not for freedom, justice, equality.
Right.
And he preferred George Schuler, the writer for the Pittsburgh Courier. He preferred the program pushed by Dr. Ambedkar. And he wrote about that and talked about it. So those are some connections that can be shown, how Dr. Ambedkar and what it was that he was teaching. Oh, he also met, I think it was with Ambedkar, and he kept asking Ambedkar questions about his people in America, the Black Untouchables in America. So Dr. Ambedkar was asking questions about the Black Untouchables in America with those words.
Wow.
You know.
That's very...
No, that was with C. Van Woodward. He met with C. Van Woodward, who traveled to India to interview Dr. Ambedkar. That's the man who wrote.
Yeah.
That's the man who wrote the book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow. And Jim Crow, in case your listeners there aren't familiar with Jim Crow just means caste, basically. Jim Crow laws are the laws that said if you belong to this caste, you can drink from this fountain. If you belong to that caste, you have to drink from this fountain. And those castes in this country are identified as black and white. Okay.
Very interesting.
Okay, they don't call them Brahmin and Shudra or Brahmin and Dalit. They call it black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Just like back in the old days, it was Varna. It was color. And Varna is the word that's used for the caste system that was set up by the Brahmins. They set up a system based on Varna. And the same system, as we've talked about before, was set up here in this country. And that system equally is based on skin color, on color, Varna. And so the Varna system that existed here, the same as the Varna system that existed there and still exists here and still exists there.
Right.
And there have been people trying to bring the two peoples together in dialogue. And that's part of what we're doing today in a small way.
This very interesting facts that you have brought up, Brother Paul, about the connections between the movements. One of the things that has been now in the discussion with this Isabel Wilkerson's book coming up has come up on caste, and she has been arguing that the caste is the category through which the racism can be studied, and her famous statement that the caste system is a bone and racism is a skin. So like in the African American circles, with this connection, the African American movement has been a global movement in terms of embracing Africa and the Latin American people of color. In your work of last 20-30 years, where you have been focusing exclusively on the movement here of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, plus the Buddhist movement in India. Do you see a kind of a change in perceptions in terms of the amount of information that the African Americans have in terms of the plights of Dalits here and the Dalit struggle?
Absolutely. Yes. We have access to a lot more information today than we did 20, 30, 40 years ago. In fact, there's a lot of information. There may be too much in some cases, because not all sometimes one can take in so much information that it's not possible to properly digest that. It's kind of like food. Information is very much like food, and it has to be taken in a little bit at a time, and properly chewed and swallowed and digested. Well, today we're living in a society where we are just blasted with a lot of facts, data, information, a lot of information. And one of the uses of that, how they keep us off track, is by just giving us too much information. But the short answer is yes. Now, I do want to comment on something that you said, Mangesh, which is true. You quoted from that book, Caste, which is a very good book. It just came out 2 days ago. And it's a very important book. It's a very important book. And interestingly, it's being promoted by the people in the middle, mainstream America. It's not yet reached to the, like the revolutionary, quote unquote, so-called, revolutionary segments in this country. So I think that once it does reach them, and the idea sort of told to them that it's okay to look at these concepts, maybe they'll start looking at, perhaps they'll start looking at them, because that's the tip of the spear. Now, she does mention that caste is to the bone, that, race is skin deep and caste is to the bone. That's one of the quotes that you just gave from out of that book. That's true to some extent. In this country, however, they have and had what's called the one drop rule, the one drop rule. And the one drop rule in the time of slavery and during the time of Jim Crow. You have one drop, what they call one drop, as if there's a drop of blood. That is black or white. If you have one drop of black, you're black. Okay, that's the one drop rule. That's to the bone. Okay. I was born in the South. And Biloxi, Mississippi. And you can look at me and I probably don't look dark. Rich toned. Okay. Except we lived in I lived in Jim Crow South. Remember the fountains that had to be drank out. You have to drink out of this water fountain, not that water fountain. I went to the first civil rights. I was very young, except my first memory, and I'm just pointing this out to show that race in this country is to the bone. It's not just skin color. It's to the bone. Okay. There was something that happened. It's one of the first things that I remember. There's maybe two things that I remember first. One of them was going to the beach with my mother in a car and taking in people who had been beaten with chains. Black men who had been beaten with chains because they wanted to swim at the beach. And this was called Bloody Sunday. Now, there was 2 or 3 Bloody Sundays, but the first Bloody Sunday, this was the first one. And it was the first civil rights, march or protest in that state, Biloxi. And that's what opened it up. So it was in the 1950s. And I remember sitting on the lap of a black man who was covered in blood, and we had rescued him. Women at that time, they were driving cars, rescuing the men who had been beaten with chains. Some of them were not dark skinned or rich complected. Okay, and so it didn't matter if you had one drop. Talking about the one drop rule in this country, that was considered you belong to that caste, and so my birth certificate would reflect that, and as would the birth certificates of anyone and everyone born in that time who had what they call one drop, the one drop rule. So I would say yes, race is skin, except it's also to the bone. It's also to the bone in this country. Slaves, if you were black, you were a slave, no matter what your complexion was. So I would differ with that somewhat, although she does make a point that's worth looking at. You can look at someone in this country who's black and identify who they are. Whereas in India, you might not be able to just look at a person and determine perhaps if they belong to this Varna or that Varna, because that's a 2,000-year-old system, or even more, perhaps more than 2,000 years old. So there's been over the centuries some type of mixture. So you can't just look at a Brahmin always until that's a Brahmin, or a Shudra until that's a Shudra. Is that correct?
That's true.
Okay. So I wouldn't say, so I would just comment on that caste is to the bone and race is somehow different. They're both the same systems. That's the reason I mentioned last talk or the talk previous that, racism is a brand new word. It didn't come into vogue until the 1950s. Well, what is it that existed previous to that? If that word was not used. So we take the language that we speak now and often think that people thought that way and spoke that way back in the 20s or back in the 30s or back during the time of slavery. And they didn't. We have some new words. There was color. There was colorism. That's what I called it our last talk. And colorism is Varna.
Yeah.
Varna and color is the same thing. So I'm showing that, I'm trying to show or demonstrate that there is the same system. There is the colored system and the colored man. Like a person who has caste in India, I'm sure they have some type of a title like Suvarna or something like that. Is there a title for someone who has caste in India?
No. Savarna means somebody who is in the Varna system. And
yes.
Avarna means somebody who is out of Avarna system. So for example,
that's what I'm saying. That's the colored man. That's what we call the colored man, Suvarna.
Right.
Now, we were taught about that. And the colored man is the man who has Varna.
Right.
Who is the colored man? That's the man who's practicing the caste system. Now, that makes sense to people over here. They will understand that and they'll say, what? They'll say, wow, that's the same thing.
Wow.
It might not make much sense to you, except you and your audience know that there is Suvarna. There are people in the system, in the caste system. And then there are people who are out of it, who are not part of the caste system. And the caste system has a top and it has a bottom. And there are people on the bottom of this system, like the color system. And in America, the people at the bottom of the color system are Black people.
Right. So when we are drawing on these connections between the race and caste, and in the 1940s, in 46, when Babasaheb Ambedkar wrote about untouchability or slavery, what is worse, there he talked about these three problems of that time: the problem of Jews in Germany, Nazi Germany, the African American racism, and the Indian problem of the untouchability and widely the caste system. And he tries to talk about these three categories together. And very interestingly, we see that in a recent book, Wilkerson has also tried to talk about these three problems as a kind of the part of the caste system. And she has went on to discover that the Nazis went to the south of America and tried to study the Jim Crow laws and the other laws which segregated the people, so on and so forth, and also tried to implement those things in the Nazi Germany. And in India, we say that there was a very important book written here, a small book, which called "Who is the Mother of Hitler?" And it traces back the origin of rise of Hitler to this kind of a caste system, the symbolism that Hitler took, swastika and Aryanism and so on and so forth. So I think when we discuss these interconnections, we can look back into the history and see that how particularly Babasaheb Ambedkar was looking at the problem of the slavery in America and that of exploitation, of the subjugation of the Jews in Germany and Europe in general. So I think, these are very vital pieces of jigsaw that are coming together in our generations, where we are trying to understand what was really happening there. But I think one of the parts of the connection between the Babasaheb Ambedkar's movement here and also the African American movement there. We know that, as I was telling in the beginning, that a lot of Indians were traveling in the 20s, in the beginning of the last centuries, interacting with the African Americans, and we are learning a lot from the African American struggle. And actually, the studies have brought this into fore, that how the so-called leaders of the freedom movement were learning a lot from the African American intellectuals and activists. Even Gandhi was very inspired. Don't know this side of the story as to how the African Americans influenced the sort of freedom struggle in India, but now there is a solid research which throws light on this. But we know that Dalits were also marginalized.
Can you say that?
There was a singular voice of Babasaheb Ambedkar, and he was reaching out to the African. Yeah.
Yes. Would you mind saying that again, because you were buffering? I caught what you said, but it's important that I don't know if the audience caught it. You're saying that the movement in India was very much influenced by things that were happening in this country among Black people, and that inspired groups such as the Dalit Panthers, for instance.
Because that is in the 70s. Brother Paul, can you hear me? Am I clear?
I can now. I can hear you now, but it was buffering for a few moments.
So that was a time when India was at the verge of getting power transferred from the British to the Indians.
Yes.
That was a period 46.
Yes.
And the British were not taking into account the Dalits when the transfer of power was taking place in 46. Before that, they were making Dalits as a party to the discussion on the transfer of power. But in 46 onwards, they didn't take into consideration. So Babasaheb Ambedkar was doing a lot of international advocacy. Okay. So after the World War II, there was this, the formation of UN was taking place, and W.E.B. Du Bois was arguing on the behalf of the African Americans that, the kind of contradictory nature of the American government, saying that, they are trying to put in place the framework of human rights, but even in America, the human rights of African Americans is violated. And he drafted one later. He drafted one later, very important document. He edited it. A lot of people wrote it. He edited it, and he made a submission to the United Nations on the behalf of the colored people of the world. Okay. So on the similar line, Babasaheb Ambedkar wanted to make appeal to the United Nations, because that time the rights of the Dalits in India were in the danger, and Babasaheb was saying that don't give us to the caste Hindus with our hands and feet tied, bounded hands and feet. And that's why, I think this letter is so important. I'm going to read it for you, Brother Paul, the letter that Babasaheb Ambedkar sent to Professor Du Bois. Can I read that letter? Because I think it's a very interesting letter.
It is, and the audience needs to hear it.
Yeah. So the letter in 1946, where Babasaheb Ambedkar has written to W.E.B. Du Bois, it reads like this: Dear Professor Du Bois, also I have not met you personally. I know you by name as everyone does who is working in the cause of securing liberty to the oppressed people. It's a short letter. I belong to the Untouchables of India, and perhaps you might have heard my name. I have been a student of the Negro problem and have read your writings throughout.
Yes.
We know that Du Bois has written a lot on Asia. His book Soul of Black Fox is a novel, with having an Indian character and the connection with African American. There is a love story. And when Babasaheb Ambedkar says that he has read his writing throughout, means he has read everything that Professor Du Bois might have written. There is so much similarity between the position of the untouchables in India and of the position of the Negroes in America, that the study of the latter is not only natural but necessary. So being a student of the African American struggle, Babasaheb Ambedkar is saying that the study is not only natural but also it's necessary. And you know that we have been following the movements of African Americans in the 70s and 80s. Even today, we take keen interest in what is happening in the Black America. So further, I will read in the last paragraph. I was very much interested to read that the Negroes of America have filed a petition to the UNO. That time, the Black African American word didn't exist. So this is just the word that existed.
Yes.
Negro word. I know that there are a lot of issues with N words, but that was a time in 40s where I think this word might be in the currency. So Babasaheb Ambedkar writes, I was very much interested to read that the Negroes of America have filed a petition to the UNO, United Nations Office. The Untouchables of India are also thinking of following suit. Will you be so good as to secure for me 2 or 3 copies of this representation by the Negroes and send them to my address? I need hardly say how very grateful I shall be for your troubles in this behalf. And that time, Professor Du Bois was teaching in University of Atlanta, Georgia, in 1950.
And yes, it's a very, very important letter. And Dr. Du Bois wrote him back.
Should I read it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, definitely.
So Professor Du Bois writes Babasaheb Ambedkar on 31st July in 1946. And he writes, my dear Mr. Ambedkar, I have your letter concerning the case of the Negroes of America and the Untouchables in India before the United Nations. As you say, a small organization of American Negroes, the National Negro Congress, has already made a statement which I am enclosing. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I think, however, that a much more comprehensive statement well documented will eventually be laid before the United Nations by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. If this is done, I shall be glad to send you a copy. And this is the last paragraph of the letter. I have often heard of your name and work, and of course, I have every sympathy with the Untouchables of India. I shall be glad to be of any service I can render, if possible, in the future.
Yes, and so that was Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yeah.
Joining hands and joining forces with Dr. Ambedkar, the leader of the Dalit movement in India, and the two of them were interested in presenting their cases to the UN. And they were working in tandem. They were working hand in hand, and they were exchanging ideas and information and dialoguing, because they both recognize that it's a similar struggle, that it's the same struggle, that they're fighting for the same things. Dr. Ambedkar, as you noted at the very beginning, was just a few blocks away from 125th Street in Harlem for years. So he was well aware. And that's why when the writer went to visit him, C. Van Woodward went to visit him and to question him, he kept asking him about, Dr. Ambedkar kept asking him about the Black Untouchables of America. Because we've known that there is a connection, that there is the same, that we are fighting the same war. geographically we are on different fronts, but we are fighting the same war. And so this is something that
Right.
people in the past who know, who had the information, they didn't have Google. They didn't have the Google, but they knew because they studied. Dr. Ambedkar, as you noted, when he said that I am familiar with your works, that means he read everything, because Dr. Ambedkar was a scholar of the highest caliber, of the utmost caliber. And so, like you said, if he said, I'm familiar with your works, that means he read everything.
Yeah, yeah.
He read the back page, he read in between the pages, he read everything.
When we talk about this thing, there some scholars have been arguing that Du Bois was advocating a concept of talented 10.
Yeah.
Talented 10 means, and some people say that it was a sort of a creating the elitism among the African Americans. But the similar concept that we find in Dr. Ambedkar's writing and speeches, where he talks about the intellectual class to guide the masses. So here Du Bois talks about the talented 10, the guardians of the community, the people who will look after, dedicate their everything for the community. And here Babasaheb Ambedkar also similarly talks about the intellectual class which will be similarly committed to their masses, to safeguard their interests, to safeguard their rights. And also, this concept of double consciousness that is there in Du Bois' writing, very prominent. So I think, a lot of things, have been, as you said rightly, that, Babasaheb Ambedkar says that he has studied him throughout. That means he has read a lot of his fundamental books, the sociology of the blacks, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a very important connection between the Dalits and the blacks that was taking place.
Absolutely.
Before we end this conversation today, we got another 10-15 minutes to go, but I would like to begin with asking a question that the time, that was a time when there was not much information available, there was not much spread of internet, but you took interest in the Ambedkarite movement, Dalit movement 20 years before back, and you have been a student of what is happening in India for a long time, to the extent that you have founded Word Dhamma Foundation, and it's very interesting to me, and I think it will be very interesting to the audience as to when did you start getting to know about the Dalit movement in India? What fascinated you so much that you have devoted considerable part of your life to understanding the movement in India, and also try to create the bridges between the communities for a long time. So what is your experience? What is your history of this immense interest in the Ambedkarite movement in India?
Can I answer part of that?
Yeah,
part of it. Different. Okay, part of it. Okay, because you and I think we met back in 2007.
Yeah, maybe
we had met 2007 because I had written a editorial on a blog that was called Uplift Them. It was called Uplift Them. It was a blog, and you had read that blog in India. Then you were doing a tour working on behalf of the Dalit cause in America, and we agreed that we would meet. And it was soon after that you and I worked together in the planning of the first modern Black Buddhist and Dalits up in San Francisco. You were there, a part of that planning, and we had Black Buddhists in this country, America, together with Dalits, as well as we had people from some other countries. I think there was a sister there from another country, in England.
Yeah.
Remember that? Okay. And that was in San Francisco in 2008. Previous to that, I was working with the Ambedkar Center for Justice and Peace. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. Very much.
Yes, I started working with him in about 2003, and he was carrying on Dr. Ambedkar's work, presenting his case, the case of the Dalit people, to the UN, United Nations. So he was training me as his national coordinator for some of his work here, because he lived up in Canada, which is on the northern border of America. So he also sometimes lived down in this country in Pennsylvania. He's since moved home. So that's going back to like 2003, working with him and working with you.
Yeah.
The way that I was introduced, very briefly, the way that I was took interest in the struggle in India is through the school that I come out of, because I haven't always been aware of the connection between India and blacks in this country. But I'm a student of W.D. Farad, who is from India and who taught in the 1930s. And it was from studying his work that led me to understand the importance, just like, was it Dr. Ambedkar who said that it's not only something that can be known, but it's necessary to know the connection between India and the blacks of this country, that's necessary. Is that Dr. Ambedkar who said that?
Yeah. We just read the letter.
Okay, so I likewise think that it's also, necessary, and that's part of what I was taught, or what I see in the teachings, that it's necessary for us to do what we're doing now, to take interest in the struggle, not just in this country, but worldwide, particularly in India, because the caste system is so ancient there, it's so old there, and it's so persistent there, that we can see the history of the development of the kind of problems that are now just being recognized in this country as caste. A very important book was just released a few days ago. The book really doesn't say much new. As you know, it doesn't say much new.
Yeah.
But it says something to a large audience.
Right.
That to that large audience, it is new.
Right.
It's and that's what makes it so important, because there's so many things that have to be known and studied and sort of grappled with, so that we can come to an understanding of what is the problem, and then we can start to solve for that problem.
Right. Well, that's very interesting journey that you just enumerated, just to the audience. And now, I can see that there is a growing interest among the African American circles about what is happening in India. A lot of individuals are writing about the plights of Dalits and finding the connection, trying to reach out. There have been attempts in India to invite the African American academia and to expose them to what is happening. And I think it's altogether a different level that this interaction has now reached, where not only the academicians are contributing to it. One of the interesting things before we conclude, Brother Paul, is I think in 2016 I was in conference in Bangalore, and Martin Luther King's son came, and he called Babasaheb Ambedkar his father's revolutionary brother.
Say that again slowly. He called
Babasaheb Ambedkar Martin Luther King's revolutionary brother.
Revolutionary brother. Okay.
Yeah, that's what he called. But there was an interesting presentation by an African American professor, Professor Kevin Brown, who sort of talked about Babasaheb Ambedkar in a very different light. He said that he enumerated the very important figures in the African American movements, like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Thurgood Marshall, Booker T. Washington, and W.B. Du Bois. And he said that all these beautiful personalities of our movement can be combined in Babasaheb Ambedkar.
Yes. And he said it in a way that is so true. Dr. Ambedkar, as he pointed out, he was a scholar.
Yeah.
He was and to quote that scholar, he was a bodhisattva in the Buddhist tradition, which is quite a statement, because we can't leave out the Dhamma. We can't leave the Dhamma and the role that plays in the movement, because that's the first and only movement that destroys caste.
Yeah.
Dr. Ambedkar wrote a book that you're aware of. It's called what's the title of it? The Destroying of Caste, or the
Annihilation of Caste.
Annihilation of Caste.
Yeah.
Annihilation of Caste. And then he later wrote a book called The Buddha and His Dhamma, where he, Dr. Ambedkar, along with 500,000 Dalits, turned to the Dhamma. They started practicing Dhamma, and then a few months later, another 500,000 did the same in one location. That's not counting the people who are outside of that location. So, the Dhamma is very much a part of the Ambedkar movement. In terms of the 10%, the intellectual class, there's much that they can do. Except if they become the servants of the people. If they become the servants of the people, because the struggle is for the little man and woman, is for the ones on the bottom. It's not necessarily for the smarty pants, the brainiacs. They can lead, or they can shine light in areas that we don't know anything about. Except one of the dangers is that the 10% often want to take control and become the new Brahmins. They want to be. Sometimes that happens because of the power that they have, because they're so smart.
Right.
That they say, "Oh, I'm smart enough that I can trick these people." So they do have a role that they can play if they become the servants of the people. Dr. Ambedkar was a supreme intellectual. However, he was a servant of the people. He did everything that he did for his people. The one of the people who you mentioned, Dr. Du Bois, he was somewhat tainted by Gandhi. Some of his ideas, sort of tricked him into thinking that caste wasn't as bad as it is.
True.
And that came about because he listened to Gandhi, who was a staunch opponent to the rise of the lower castes and the destruction of the caste system. But Gandhi wanted the caste system to stay here, to remain. And so he did sort of talk to W.E.B. Du Bois and kind of got him off track a little bit in some areas relative to caste. Yes. Is there anything from the sister? Does she has anything?
Yeah. I think before
Dr. Farhana.
Yes, and now I think today we are ending our discussion here. Wonderful.
No calls.
No calls today, but I think there will be questions. We are having two more conversations. Another is very interesting round of conversation on Buddhism, Buddhist connections between the communities, and the last one will be how we can work together. So thank you, Brother Paul, for joining this conversation. I hand it over to Farhana, Dr. Farhana, to take the session further.
Thank you so much.
Sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the speaker, Sir Paul and Mangesh sir, and all the listeners who have patiently listened to us. And thank you so much, Sir Paul. So once again, I wish to thank you so much, and for the nice conversation, sir. Thank you and have a good night. That's all, sir. I hand it over to Mangesh sir.